Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I am here with two special guests. Once again, we have Christopher Tomaszewski down below, and we have a new guest this time, Professor Walter Matthews Grant. A lot of you might know Professor Grant's work from Free Will and God's Universal Causality. He's been on multiple podcasts before, and I thought, it was about time that I got Professor Grant on my channel as well. And who better than my resident Thomist, Christopher Tomaszewski. So, gentlemen, it's so great to have you on. Christopher, how have you been?
I've been great, Swan. Just finished up another year at Belmont Abbey. Looking forward to going up for tenure soon. My wife has been involved with helping to found a new classical Catholic school down here in Charlotte. And it's a great, vibrant Catholic community. So we're both delighted to be here. And everything's been going great with me. Yeah.
And Professor Grant, how have you been?
I've been great. Thanks so much for having me on the show. Life's good. Just looking forward to the summer. We've got a nice, beautiful day in Minnesota. It's not snowing. Great.
Well, today's conversation is really to set up a conversation between you and Christopher. And I'll get into why in particular I thought you two would be particularly good conversation partners. But just for the sake of the audience, I wanted to get across basically what are the concepts that we need to know and comprehend. And Professor Grant, I thought maybe I'll start with you. Can you just walk us through some of the basic terminology here, like libertarian free will, God's universal causality, occasionalism, just whatever you think is necessary just to get us a foundation?
Yeah. So, I think, what we want to talk about is how to reconcile, if it's possible to reconcile God's universal causality with human freedom, or any kind of creaturely freedom, but we'll talk about human freedom. And so what do we mean by God's universal causality? We start there. So it's a traditional theological doctrine that God is the source and cause of all that exists apart from himself. This is held by the mainstream Catholic tradition. You find it in doctors of the church like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, St. Anselm, and on up. When contemporary philosophers are often giving an account of what theists have traditionally held, they will often include the idea that God is the cause of all entities apart from himself among those things that theists have held. Right. So it's got, I think there's a strong case that can be made that it's the scriptural view, or that it's a position that best enables us to interpret all that we find Scripture saying about God's relationship to everything other than himself. It's there are various philosophical arguments that people have given for it. Okay, so but it does raise questions about the relationship between divine and creaturely agency, both really free and non-free agency. But we'll talk about maybe the questions it raises for free agency. So, if God is in fact the cause of all that exists, distinct from himself, well, among those things that exist are creaturely actions, are my actions, or your actions. Even our free actions would be things in some broad sense that exist. And so it would turn out that God is the cause of those as well. And here, I think it's important to note that the doctrine of God's universal causality, it doesn't mean that God is just some remote cause. So the source of 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 something, right? Mm-hmm. The idea is that God is truly the cause and source, we might say, directly or immediately of what exists apart from himself. So the implication would be that our actions are directly caused or sourced by God. And then it raises the question, well, if that's the case, how can they be up to us? How can they be actions for which we're morally responsible? How can they be free? How could I have done otherwise, if that's what freedom requires, than what God caused me to do? Okay, and so those are the sort of questions that have to be faced by those who want to affirm the traditional doctrine of God's universal causality alongside human freedom. So far, so good.
Yeah, and just could you expand upon like what definition of freedom you're working with and trying to preserve, just in case there might be compatibilists in the audience.
Absolutely, yeah. So there are different conceptions of what freedom requires. Okay, and one of the big debates or differences among philosophers is between those who think that freedom is compatible with determinism, a comprehensive determinism of events, including our actions, and those who think that freedom is not compatible with a comprehensive determinism. And those who think that it's compatible with determinism are typically called compatibilists, and those who think that it's not are typically called incompatibilists. And then those incompatibilists who affirm freedom, so they think we do have freedom and therefore determinism is false, are typically called libertarians. Okay? So I may speak largely in terms of libertarian and compatibilists here. So all parties here are people who affirm freedom. And the question is really whether or not freedom is consistent with determinism. Now, the worry for people who think that freedom is not consistent with determinism is that God's universal causality would introduce a kind of comprehensive determinism. It would mean that our actions are determined, they're necessitated by prior factors outside our control. And if they think that that's incompatible with freedom, that sort of determinism, in other words, if they're libertarians about freedom, then they're going to think that if we want to continue to affirm freedom, we've got to reject divine universal causality. Compatibilists, maybe it's easier for them, right? If you think that freedom and determinism are compatible, and you say, well, divine universal causality introduces determinism, well, you might say, well, no big deal. I already think they're compatible, right? So there's maybe an easier way out if you're a compatibilist. I happen to have libertarian intuitions, incompatibilist intuitions about freedom, and so I wanted to hold on to divine universal causality, but I also wanted to hold on to a libertarian conception of freedom, and so there was some work to do there, and so the book you were pointing to earlier is an attempt to do that. So we can talk more about in detail what determinism means in this context.
Yeah, sure, we can do that. And if Christopher wants to expand on anything, you can hop in as well.
Yeah, Christopher, jump in anytime.
No, yeah. All sounds good to me so far. I guess I'll just add very briefly, jumping all the way back to like the Christian commitment to universal causality. Like, this is so strong. It's just worth noting that this is so strong so early on, right? That this is what leads to the Augustinian embrace of a privation theory of evil to deal with reconciling universal causality with, of course, the other fundamental Christian commitment to the proposition that God is not in any way the author of any moral evils. So in a certain sense, right, that the Christian embrace of the Neoplatonic theory of privation theory of evil is driven by how fundamental the Christian commitment very early on is to divine universal causality. But yeah, otherwise I think everything that Dr. Grant is saying is completely right.
No. So that's a good point. Yeah. So it's very, very old and well established within the tradition. So I mean, determinism is one of these words, like a lot of philosophical words, much to my frustration and my students' frustration, that can get used in different ways. Sometimes determine might almost just be used as a synonym for cause, right? I've read theologians that seem to use it that way sometimes, right? So to say that God determines causes everything, and to say that God determines everything would be one and the same thing, right?
So just sorry, not to interrupt. I just have a reading recommendation for everybody on this, which is Elizabeth Anscombe has an excellent article called Causality and Determination, in which she argues against this view, right? So that this is so widespread, even back in Anscombe's day, that she feels compelled to point out to everyone that causality is not determination.
Yeah.
So I would recommend that for everybody. That was a really eye-opening article for me in thinking about all the issues we're about to dive into.
Yeah, yeah, a very good paper by Anscombe. So the sense of determine here that I think is relevant for free will debates is it sense, what does it mean for an event to be determined? It means that there is some factor prior to that event, not necessarily temporally prior, often temporally prior, but maybe more importantly, causally or explanatorily prior. There's some factor that's prior to the event in question, and that is the language I like to use is logically sufficient for the event in question. In other words, it's not possible for that factor to hold or obtain without the events holding or obtaining. Okay. In other words, it's a factor that is prior to the event and that necessitates the event. Doesn't make it absolutely metaphysically necessary, but it means you can't have that factor without also having the event in question. Okay. So libertarians think that if all of our acts have determining factors like that, factors that are prior to and logically sufficient for our acts, then we can't be free, right? And they might think that for a variety of reasons. They might think that freedom requires that at least at some point I have the ability to do otherwise than I do, all prior conditions remaining the same, So in this sense, given the exact same conditions in which I raise my right arm, let's say, I could have refrained from raising my right arm. Maybe I raised my left arm instead, right? In those very same conditions, prior conditions, I could have done otherwise. Well, determinism seems to take that kind of ability to do otherwise away, right? That is to say, given the conditions prior to my act, if my act is determined, there was only one thing I could do: raise my right arm. I really did not have the ability to do otherwise, right? So if ability to do otherwise, all prior conditions is necessary for freedom, and I have an intuition that it is at least at some point, right? Then determinism is going to be a problem. Libertarians might think that our acts have to be ultimately up to us or within our control in order to be free. And it might seem like if our acts are simply determined by prior factors outside our control, then that would take away our own control of our actions, or the sense in which they're up to us. Okay. And I tend to be sympathetic with those sorts of requirements or conditions for freedom and moral responsibility. So the worry is then, if you've got, again, God causing our actions, that you've got the introduction of something that determines us to do what we do, in that sense of necessitating that we do what we do. So we can't do otherwise than we do, and what we do is not ultimately up to us. Maybe it's ultimately up to God, right? But it's not ultimately up to us. Okay, so that's the problem that I'm trying to find a solution for, and I could speak to that here in a second. But maybe we'll pause and see if anything Christopher wants to add or questions you have, Suan.
I'll just add one other point at this stage, which is to say that I guess that this is the first point of difference between us, namely that I am very comfortable with what I would call theological determinism, and I'm also very comfortable calling myself a a compatibilist of some sort, and so I don't share this intuition about libertarianism that Dr. Grant has. I'm very comfortable calling myself a compatibilist and a theological determinist, and saying that God determines every positive thing that occurs. But as I think we'll hopefully get into, I think a lot of the issues we're about to get into and things that we're about to say go towards showing that, at least in a divine case, determinism, compatibilism, the line between compatibilism and libertarianism might be fuzzy or porous, or just not very significant. But we'll see. I don't know. This might be a disagreement, or it might just be a verbal issue. I don't know.
I would love to hear that, and I'm open, like I would say I have libertarian intuitions. It's not like I have, really chased down the libertarian compatibilist debate all the way to the roots, to the point where I could imagine myself being, convinced that, determinism and free will, are compatible, but it's not. The arguments for incompatibilism have moved me, or sit with at least my the intuitions that I come to it with. So anyway,
I'm not moved much by the contemporary literature either. I guess this just comes from my perspective, being I guess as a good analytic Thomist of a certain sort. I'm happy to just use the word compatibilism to talk about the theoretical result that comes from applying medieval concurrentism about causality to human free choice.
So maybe we'll get I'll be interested whether at the end of the day it's just a different use of the words. Because I'm using the words here, determinism and compatible, in a pretty technical sense. It may turn out that you're using it in a sense that is different, but anyway, or maybe not.
I'm just using it in the sense of I think God determines what I do, and that I'm still morally responsible for it. So I'm free in the sense of I bear moral responsibility for things that God determines me to do.
And so, if it's okay for me to just continue with this discussion.
Sorry.
So
go ahead.
When you say God, when you say God determines what we do, does that imply for you that that God's determining introduces some factor that is both prior to my act and logically sufficient?
So that's we probably should, for the benefit of the audience, have a little bit more setup of your theory before we get to that question, because I think that may end up being the crucial difference between us. Because in my early thought about this, I think I was probably on the very same page as you were in your book. But now I'm worried about issues that occurred to me a long time ago and that have now been developed in the literature, for example, by Joseph Smith in his providential collapse paper and so forth, for things that have nothing to do with free will, but just have to do with God's ability to, our ability to say that God creates in a way that means he involves him having meaningful control over what he creates, that there has to be some factor. Yes, I think maybe some determining prior factor, but whether that factor is in the physical order or in the intentional order is, I think, something that's going to make a tremendous amount of difference, at least as I see things.
All right. Okay, so maybe we come back to that, and I'll go ahead and try to unroll the basics, of kind of the position I've developed, and then we can see,
and Professor, really quick, maybe what I can do is I can just wrap up the two questions on the docket just together, and then after you're done explaining your theory, you and CRISPR can just go right back into the conversation, just to just to get things out of the way.
Okay.
So basically, the reason why I had Christopher on the show was because Christopher told me that he kind of came up with something like the dual sources account on his own, but then he found out that you had already laid it out really beautifully. So I thought, like, okay, it'd be great to have you two talking about it. And so I just want to have you now talk about the dual sources account. And then from there, I think Christopher can just come in and continue the conversation.
Okay. Yeah. So how do you reconcile God's universal causality with libertarian freedom, which is what I'm trying to do here? I think it's going to, the key question is whether God's causing our acts introduces some determining factor. Does it introduce some factor that is prior to my act and logically sufficient for my act? Now, I think on some, what I would think of as fairly popular ways of thinking about God's agency in our own day, I think it would introduce some determining factor. Okay, so some people, they think of when God brings about something, that there's some sort of prior divine choice or decree in virtue of which he brings about what he does. And that is to say, this prior divine choice or decree is a kind of tertium quid, a third thing between God and what he brings about. What's you might say what's really bringing about the effect is God plus this decree of God's, or God plus this choice of God's. Okay, but you might think, well, it's not possible for God to will or decree something and that thing not come about, right? So now you've got a picture where you've got God's bringing about some effect E, introduces this decree or this choice of God, which is both prior to the effect, since that's this third thing in virtue of which he brings about the effect. It's that by means of which he brings about that effect, and it's logically sufficient for the effect, so it determines it. So now imagine that the effect in question is my act. For God to cause my act on this model is for him to introduce a determining factor, contrary to libertarian freedom. Okay, or leaving the decrees and choices, divine decrees and choices out of the picture for a second. Some might just think that God's act of causing some effect, E, that act itself is prior to E. In the way that you might think my tapping my fingers on a keyboard is an act that is prior to the email that I've just created. Okay, it's actually you might think that the tapping my fingers on the keyboard, in a sense, is my act of causing the email, and the typing is prior to the email. Well, you might think in the same way, God's act of causing E is something in God that is prior to and logically sufficient for what he brings about. Again, that means it determines what he brings about. Determine in the technical sense, it introduces a prior and logically sufficient factor. Okay, so I want to reject those two models. One we might call the prior divine decree model. The other we might call a prior divine act model. I want to reject those two models of divine agency, and I want to replace it with what I call the extrinsic model of divine agency, which is inspired by at least some things that you find in St. Thomas. On the extrinsic model of divine agency, for God to bring about an effect, if you ask what that consists in, it's just the effect qua dependent on God, or it's just the effect with its relation of causal dependence on God. Sometimes Aquinas will talk about creation, and he'll say that in certain places that creation has the creature as its subject, and it just is the creature with its relation of dependence on God. And these are some of the passages in Thomas that are sources for this idea. There's more that Aquinas says that complicates pictures, but the idea of the extrinsic model is that for God to bring about an effect, if you ask, what is the divine act of causing an effect consist in? It's just the effect with its relation of dependence on God. Now, if that's what God's causing an effect, or God's causing my act consists in, it turns out that it doesn't introduce any factor that is prior to and logically sufficient for the act. Why not? Well, God is certainly on my account. God is prior to my act. God is the cause of my act, and so God is causally prior to my act. But God isn't logically sufficient for my act. That is to say, you could have God without having my act, right? God's act of causing my act is logically sufficient for my act, right? It's not possible for you to have God causing my act and not to have my act. But on the extrinsic model of divine agency that I've just described, God's act of causing my act is not prior to my act, because it consists in my act with its relation of dependence on God. And nothing can be prior to that in which it consists or partially consists, all right? And so you have a model of God's agency where God can cause my act without rendering it determined. If God can cause my act without rendering it determined, then he can cause my act without taking away my ability to do otherwise, all prior conditions remaining the same. So imagine, leaving God out of the picture for a second, imagine that I perform an act where I had the ability to do otherwise, all prior conditions remaining the same. Okay. And now add that God has caused that act, right? What would God's causing my act have to involve in order to make it such that it turns out it's not the case that I had the ability to do otherwise, all antecedent conditions remaining the same? Well, God's causing my act would have to introduce some prior condition that precludes my doing otherwise. And that's precisely what God's act, causing my act, doesn't introduce on the extrinsic model. So it's consistent with the ability to do otherwise, all prior conditions remaining the same. Let me stop there and see if there anything you want to add or follow-up questions.
Yeah, Christopher, go right ahead. Mm-hmm.
No, I don't have any. Do you want me to just start in on how I'm seeing everything here, or are we just doing questions right now?
Yeah, I mean, Christopher, if you don't have any questions, then I think we can just move to the conversation, and I'll go manage the live chat, and
okay.
I'll be basically off screen, but I'll still be here.
Okay, great. So I guess I'll just start this with a piece of intellectual autobiography, I suppose, because I think this is also a great illustration of how philosophical topics that initially appear unconnected, in fact, are deeply connected, which happens all the time. But this is just one excellent instance that happened in my own life, I guess. Well, it's interesting. I don't think, Matthews, did you use the term divine simplicity yet? Have you used that term at all yet?
No, I haven't.
Right. Okay, great.
But go ahead. I mean, I can say,
yeah. So
this is all very much connected in my mind to divine simplicity.
Right. Yeah. Okay, good. So, well, I just found that fascinating because that's where this all starts for me. And you just set out the whole case without ever using the term. So it is, as I said, a great illustration of how initially apparently disparate philosophical topics are in fact deeply connected. So I, as I guess, Swan's viewers and readers of my work will know, have spent a lot of time thinking and working on divine simplicity. And in particular, back in my years at Baylor, I was very interested in an argument that I came to know from people on Facebook, in fact, concerning the so-called modal collapse argument against divine simplicity. And I'll just recap this very quickly, but if you want the full details, you can and people don't know what I'm talking about, go see my analysis paper, Collapsing the Modal Collapse Argument, and my chapter in the Classical Theism volume by Jonathan Fuqua and Robert Koons on this whole issue. But I was concerned about arguments involving the assertion that the doctrine of divine simplicity, to which Catholics are dogmatically committed and classical theists are theoretically committed, entails a modal collapse. It means that everything becomes necessary. Every apparently contingent fact is in fact necessary. And the basic reason for this, right, is on the doctrine of divine simplicity, God is identical with not just his attributes, but also his acts. And this is mostly just to do with the fact that acts on a broadly Aristotelian ontology are a kind of accident inhering in a thing. And so if God were not identical with his acts would be accidents inhering in him. And this is incompatible with his being purely actual, as the classical theist tradition maintains. Right. So we have God being identical with his act. God exists necessarily. It looks like this entails that his act exists necessarily. And if his act exists necessarily, the worry here is that everything which is a consequence of his act and follows necessarily. And of course, what follows from his act, if we're accepting divine universal causality, is literally everything, right? Everything is a consequence of divine action. And so if God is necessary and his divine action is necessary, then his everything is necessary. That's broadly the idea here. If there are people in the chat who want to ask further questions about that, then we can get into that. But I had replies to this. Again, see the aforementioned papers in analysis and the Fuqua and Koons volume. But I came to be concerned about the problem on a deeper level. One way of thinking about this is a commitment, and what is actually entailed, one of the things that actually is entailed by the doctrine of divine simplicity, is one way of putting it is that God is intrinsically the same across all possible worlds, right? So if you look at all possible worlds and what God looks like in each of those, you can't tell God apart based on any intrinsic qualities, features, properties, whatever you want to call them, in one possible world as distinguished from another possible world, right? And so the question arises, well, what is the explanation for why the created order looks different across two possible worlds if there's no difference in God across those two different possible worlds, right? So like what explains that ours is a world which includes horses, for example, right? When we accept that A, God is the reason that there's horses, or the cause of there being horses, and B, everything intrinsic to God would look exactly the same as it does now if there weren't any horses. And so I started thinking about this, and one of the things I realized as I was thinking about it, and this is where the connection with free will starts to appear, is, well, one of the things that this would also entail is that God looks intrinsically the same no matter what humans freely choose to do, right? So the world in which I, for example, freely decide to eat eggs and bacon for breakfast today, as opposed to the world in which I freely choose to eat pancakes for breakfast today, are both worlds in which God looks precisely the same intrinsically as he does in the other world, right? And so it occurred to me, I was just thinking about this, of like, okay, so what that means is when we're talking about human free choice, there's nothing in God which explains the difference between my freely choosing A and my freely choosing B, where A and B are incompatible with each other, right? And so it occurred to me, okay, so this is a problem apparently for divine simplicity, right? Like the classical theist is confronted with this problem about how we explain diversity in the created order across all possible worlds without having to rely on any diversity in God across all possible worlds. But maybe one way of thinking about it is it's a silver lining, maybe if you want to put it that way. It also means that what people are worried about with respect to divine determinism just can't be right. Right? That there's nothing in God which explains why I made one choice rather than another. And so I guess what occurred to me is like, you can't have both of these problems, right? So you can't push both of these objections, right? You can't be worried both about the consequences of divine simplicity in explaining the contingency of the created order, and also be worried that a perfectly simple God is determining our choices in a way that is incompatible with moral responsibility. And I thought, oh wow, okay, so this is a great thing I can actually say in favor of the divine simplicity view of the classical theist view, is at least insofar as it creates one problem, it by that very ipso facto it resolves another. But then I realized that Dr. Grant had already said this at book length, and was both gladdened that it had been said and saddened that I was not the first to be able to say it. But yeah, so I came to this issue through thinking about divine simplicity, and then only later thinking about how that applies to human free action. But I guess my crucial insight was just that you can't have objections both to divine simplicity as something which renders classical theists incapable of explaining diversity across possible worlds in the created order, and also be worried that a perfectly simple God is determining our actions in a way that is incompatible with human moral responsibility. Anyway, Matthews, if you want to jump in.
Yeah. I mean, I had went on and didn't say anything about divine simplicity, but I have had very similar thoughts to what you're thinking. I mean, the whole account of this extrinsic model of divine agency was something that came to me in reflecting on divine simplicity, and then realized that it has this connection to free creaturely agency as well. So seems very similar to the,
I mean, yeah, maybe you can,
what you were having.
Yeah, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, and tell me what you found in your research. But as far as I'm aware, the whole model of extrinsic divine action is motivated by the doctrine of divine simplicity, and not to deal with divine determinism per se. Is that
right?
Or have you found otherwise?
No, I think that's
okay.
I haven't found otherwise. I think that's right. I suppose one could. Well, yeah. I mean, I suppose one, apart from divine simplicity, could embrace this model of divine agency. And I think at least aspects of extrinsic model of divine agency are found in Aristotle, where he's not talking at all about about divine agency. He's just talking about agency in general. He's just talking about fire heating water and stuff like that. And he says that the act of the agent is in the patient.
Yes. Yeah. Good.
So there is. I think there's some resources for developing this account of agency that I think is needed to defend divine simplicity outside of the context of discussions about divine simplicity. But no, I mean, I don't know of anyone who has just come to this totally independently of simplicity, right?
Yeah, good.
To solve the free will problem.
But yeah, it's a very good point, because I guess again, in the way that I am thinking about these issues as someone who's primarily working on divine simplicity and the alleged problems it creates, I think accounts of extrinsic divine willing or extrinsic divine knowing, and so forth, are often I don't want to say caricatured, but I think to some degree unfairly attacked as just ad rem, responses, an ad hoc, unmotivated response to the objections being posited against divine simplicity. And I think there's two reasons here we've identified for thinking that that's not the case at all. Number one, as you put it, the extrinsicality of all agency, both at the created level and the divine level, has foundations in the way that Aristotle talks about agency in general, in a context where he's clearly not just concerned with resolving problems surrounding divine simplicity. And number two, one of the very few empirical confirmations that we can get concerning philosophical theories is when you discover that one theory can solve multiple problems, including problems it wasn't designed to solve. Yeah. And I think that's what we have an example of here with the extrinsic model of divine agency, insofar as we're seeing it resolving issues about divine simplicity, but also giving you, as we see in your book, the tools to deal with explaining how human actions can be, in a libertarian sense, at least on the technical contemporary sense of libertarian, be libertarianly free without giving up universal causality on the part of God.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. It's a nice confluence there. I'll mention a couple of other folks who I think are, who I think have something pretty close to this that I didn't discover really till later. One is Robert Koons has a paper that is, I think, in a little bit different language, because he does it in terms of truth makers and so forth, but is a very similar kind of idea. This is a paper from, I don't know, I forget exactly when, but it's in the journal Philosophia Christi. It would be worth folks looking at. And then Hugh McCann has, in several papers and in a book, had something similar to this, a book called Creation and the Sovereignty of God. I'm not sure if he ends up, what he ends up saying about divine simplicity is going to be consistent with all the moves that I want to make, but I think there's some of the moves are there. It's interesting to see the way, different people have sort of found big pieces of it, without, necessarily relying on one another's work, or and
as I said, I think that's philosophers are often in this frustrating position of not being able to get any kind of empirical confirmation of their theories, but that's one of the few tiny pieces of empirical confirmation we can get, is when other people are having the same idea and dealing with radically different problems and so forth. That's very fascinating. Well, okay, so let's come back now to where we might disagree. Because the problem the extrinsic model sets up, though, is so what is it that explains, right? So what is it that explains why the created order is like such and such in possible world P and like such and such in possible world Q, if there is no physical prior determining factor in God that is logically sufficient for making possible world P the way that it is in the created order and possible world Q the way that it is in the created order. And I guess let me just preface that question. I'm interested in your take on that, but before, let me just say, and this is in my work as well, lest people think that this is some kind of unique problem confronting classical theists who believe in divine simplicity. It's not. If you see my chapter in the Kunz and Foucault volume, I explain how every theist who believes that the divine essence is the same across all possible worlds and that all of God's accidents ultimately flow from his essence is in the same exact boat. And we can get into that if people have questions. But there's this big question, right? And about like, how do we ultimately explain the contingency of the created order if there isn't not how do we explain the contingency? I guess the contingency is the easy part on this view, but how do we explain how do we make sense of the question of the fact that God is in some way in control of what he creates?
Yeah.
How do we make sense of that?
Yeah. So how does, if God would be the same, whether he creates, this universe alpha or some other universe, what is it in God that explains why we get alpha and not?
Or to bring it back to the question of free will in connection with grace, like we could ask, what does it mean for God to give grace or to aid our wills or anything like that if God looks just the same when Peter chooses to repent as when Judas chooses to despair?
Yeah. I mean, this is an objection in a way to certain responses to the modal collapse objection to that, or to divine or any kind of divine simplicity that's going to have God the same across possible worlds, I guess, right? This has not bothered me. I mean, maybe I'm just not getting it, or maybe it's because I already accept things that are very much like it. But I mean, so on the causality thing, so you mentioned Anscombe's paper, causality and determination is not the same as determination. So not all causes determine their effects in the sense of being both prior to and logically sufficient for their effects. Okay. So I think you can have a cause of an effect that truly is a cause of the effect, and in that sense accounts for the effect. It's causes account for their effects without determining the effect, right?
Yes. Okay, good. So I don't think this is I don't think this is like a problem for PSR. Like I'm not suggesting, and I have a paper about this too, where like I argue against like, kind of these really I think strong objections to PSR to the effect that like PSR itself generates some kind of modal collapse because the only kind of truly sufficient explanation you can have of any contingent fact is an explanation which ultimately necessitates it. So I'm not suggesting that's an issue here. I think we perfectly well can say, well, God causes trees to exist, right? There are trees in the world. God causes them to exist, and he doesn't have to have determined the world to be such that there are trees in order for him to be the cause of trees. That's fine. But I guess I'm just worried about this is, not a very kind of formal or technical objection. It's just coming from the following perspective of like, in many cases of causation, and especially in many cases of intelligent causation, the causation is in some sense determinative, right? So, my own model of my own agency and action and my own mind all really kind of depends on the fact that lots of things that I've caused, I've also determined, right? So, if I were to go try to bake an apple pie, for example, and at the end, to my utter bewilderment, it's not an apple pie, but a dozen muffins that come out of the oven instead. I'd be deeply surprised and disturbed by this, right? Like, I'd be like, oh, I guess there's some sense in which I caused this to occur, but I was trying to do something else, right? And like our ordinary examples that we get from firsthand experience of agent causation, of intelligent agents causing things, are instances of frequently, almost always, are cases of determinative causation, right? In fact, when this doesn't happen, when we have cases of causation, intelligent agent causation that aren't determinative, we say there was an accident, right? An accident in the broad contemporary sense of something besides what I intended occurred.
Yeah.
And yes, I caused it, but it wasn't what I was trying to do, right? And so I guess maybe one way of thinking about this kind of worry is, how do we get out of saying that maybe there are accidents in divine agency, right? Like, how do we get away from the objection that something other than what God intended is what he caused?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are a lot of things. I kind of want to say there. Let me jump in. So let's just take like one account, like a contemporary account of agent causation, like Timothy O'Connor, the philosopher, is often kind of a go-to for this. So as I understand his account, he thinks you can have an agent, and that the basic action of that agent is the agent's bringing about. It's a causal act of bringing about in himself, I guess, an intention. Okay, to do something, right? So he brings about himself an intention, let's say, to make some muffins, and then from that intentions will causally downstream from that intention will be various bodily actions that are performed, the sort of bodily actions you need to perform in order to make muffins. Okay. But the fundamental basic act of agency is the bringing about of the intention, right? Now, prior to the bringing about of that intention, the agent cause has reasons, right? Maybe reasons for forming the intention to make the muffins, maybe reasons for doing something else instead, right? And that agent might have in those same prior conditions in which the agent formed the intention, brought about the intention to make muffins, that very same agent in those very same prior conditions might have refrained from forming the intention to make muffins. Might have formed intention that said, I'm going to go for a walk now, or I'm going to pray now, or whatever, right? So here you have an act of the agent, which on this account has to be an act of control to bring about of the intention. In fact, O'Connor will say that bringing about that intention is intrinsically an exercise of control, but it's an act where the agent could have done otherwise, all prior conditions remaining the same. So the act of bringing about an intention is not determining of that intention. It's not an instance of a deterministic cause. It's an indeterministic cause, and yet nevertheless, it's intrinsically an exercise of control by that agent. And I think we can say something similar, or by analogy, with God's bringing about some effect in the world for a reason or on purpose. Anyway, let me leave you with
I guess so. I'm wondering. Okay, let me just make sure I understand the account first. I am ashamed to admit I've not read all of Tim's work, despite being with him at Baylor for a couple of years. Let me just make sure I got the account right. I mean, it sounded like you were identifying the indeterministic step there as coming between all the reasons that I have for a certain action and the actual formation of the intention. Is that where the
Yeah.
indeterminism jumps
Yeah.
in?
Yes, exactly. So there's
Okay,
an agent who's a cause of the intention, who has
right.
various reasons to intend this or to not intend something else instead,
Okay,
not
good.
to intend that.
So
And yeah,
yeah, so let me just ask you this then, because this gets right to the heart of it. Do you think that the doctrine of divine simplicity commits us to saying that God has the same intentions across all possible worlds?
no,
No. Is
I
that
don't.
because his intentions are extrinsically denominated?
Yes, I think that
Okay.
I think the intentions are extrinsic. So for on the extrinsic model, just as God's act of bringing about some effect in the world is extrinsic, so is God's willing, you might say, right? That effect, His willing that effect and bringing it about, I wouldn't say are just the same, one and the same. Willing just adds to bringing about the fact that the bringing about is done for a reason or on purpose.
Okay,
Uh,
right. So then I'm worried that this isn't really doing any work for us because, okay, so let me rephrase it this way, right? Like, so let's just say, um, let's just put it this way. There's going to have to be an indeterministic jump between whatever it is that's the same in God across all possible worlds,
yeah,
whatever is intrinsically denominated in him, right, to whatever is extrinsically denominated in him in virtue of the variety of creatures across possible worlds, right? So, and it sounds like you want to start that jump as at least as early as our discussion of what kind of intentions God has. Okay, right. So, but I guess I'm worried then, right, about the same worry I had about action or willing is now just going to reemerge at the level of intention of how is it that we can meaningfully say that God is in control of what God intends, or where do the divine intentions come from, and so forth and so on, if they're ultimately springing from what is intrinsically the same across all possible worlds in God, intrinsically
yeah,
the same in God across all possible worlds.
yeah,
And so I guess one way of going about this, and you could tell me if you're attracted to this view. I was at first attracted to this view, and I'm still attracted to it. I don't know if I still want to go this way, but one thing to just say here is, I just deny. You could just say, as Alex Proust says, I deny a contrastive PSR, right? I don't think that every fact of the form P rather than Q has a sufficient explanation, right? So maybe there are just some contrastive brute facts. That's not to say that there are any brute facts implicator, right? We could still have like a PSR for all these simple facts, but maybe PSR just breaks down at the contrastive level. Maybe there are some facts of the form P rather than the Q that are, we could say, contrastively brute, not simply brute, but they're contrastively brute. And so we could say things like, for example, God explains why there are trees, right? And we could also say, at some level, right, God also explains why there are not unicorns. But maybe, right, God doesn't explain why there are trees rather than unicorns, or something like that, because maybe there just is no explanation for facts of that type. Is that attractive to you?
yeah. I don't. I'm inclined to agree with Proust as I understand on denying a certain kind of contrastive explanation. I don't think we get that from God, given divine simplicity, and I don't think we get that, in just ordinary human libertarian agent causality. Let me return back to you, because you asked the question, how do we explain, or how you asked the question, how is God in control of his intentions?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we started. So I think we could pose the same question. How is O'Connor's libertarian agent cause in control of his intentions? He causes intention X, right? But given the very same antecedent conditions, he might not have caused intention X. He might have caused intention Y or Z. How is he in control? Well, I think what O'Connor would say is that the agent causal act of bringing about the intention is intrinsically an exercise of control. It's not an exercise of control in virtue of some prior state of the agent that determines the intention, but the bringing about of the intention is itself is intrinsically an exercise of control. Well, if I can say that with regard to creaturely agents and the bringing about of their effects, it seems like I should be able to say the same thing about the divine agent and the bringing about of his effects.
Okay.
And so that's, and given that, I mean, just dialectically, given that, at least for me, many of my interlocutors here, the ones that, my audience, are other libertarians who are committed to the kind of thing
it's good. Yep.
Committed to. It's very hard for them to object. If I had a determinist compatibilist, who insisted on the kind of contrastive explanation of a certain sort, it'd be a different story. But my I was already comfortable,
Right.
Like at the creaturely level with this sort of situation. So why shouldn't I be comfortable with it at the divine level as well? Yeah.
Great point. I love that point. So just to hook this back up, I guess, with the contemporary literature, another term we haven't yet used, or objection in this literature that we haven't yet alluded to, is the so-called luck objection to libertarianism, which is what you just articulated, right? So one of the objections to libertarianism from determinists, mostly compatibilists, is that it just seems like it's a matter of luck as to what free choice a libertarian agent happens upon, because there is no prior determining factor that would be logically sufficient for their intending X rather than Y, and so forth. Right. Good. Yeah. So I had that same thought as well. And again, in the context of the divine case of people like Joe Schmid, his paper on providential collapse, of like, well, this just sounds a lot like the luck objection to ordinary human libertarian free will. And if it fails there, as all libertarians are committed to saying it does, then it should fail in the divine case as well.
No.
And I agree with you. I don't find the luck objections against libertarian free will very convincing. Or at least, they're not very convincing. They're certainly not very convincing, I think, to anybody who has antecedent libertarian intuitions. Because I think they're ultimately just appealing to intuitions that the libertarian started off rejecting when they decided they liked the libertarian intuitions. Good. Yeah, that's so I guess it's worth pointing out here, though, where I guess the analogy exactly comes in, because at least in the human creaturely, in the creaturely case, and it just, let's keep it to humans. Let's not complicate things by putting angels in it. Right. My intentions, human intentions, are not extrinsically denominated, right? Intentions are actually something that happen inside of me and are a kind of determining factor in what I then cause external to me, right? So like, it's my intention to bake an apple pie rather than a dozen muffins is what explains why I move my body in the ways that are necessary to bake an apple pie rather than a dozen muffins, and so on. And so this, we're not going to be able to say that about God, right? What we're going to have to give up in the divine case is saying that there's anything going, or you tell me if you think this is right. Do we have to completely give up on the idea that there's anything going on in the mind of God in virtue of which he determines his creative act to be productive of such an created effects X rather than created effects Y?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not inclined to think that you need anything there.
Right.
So I think you're right that in the case of the human agent, the intention that is brought about is, as it were, an accident that an intrinsic accident brought about by the agent in himself, from which, and it's some sort of cognitive state, presumably, from which follows certain bodily motions if they're not impeded, from which follow down the road certain kinds of effects in the world outside the human person that he's trying to achieve, right, through his action, say some nice warm blueberry muffins on the table. So in God, there's not an intention brought about as an intrinsic accident in him, for sure. So is there something? Is there something in God at all that's needed there? I mean, I don't see that there is. So O'Connor, by the way, he has I don't know if you've seen this, Chris. There's a paper he has on this issue, on where he applies. He makes the exact same comparison we've just kind of gone through. And so, at least at the time of his writing that paper, which I think was in the early 2000s or late 90s, even, I don't know. It's he thought you could defend divine simplicity, along these lines.
Okay, yeah, good, great. So I think I'm sure that Suan wants to open it up for questions, but let me just. I think we're now in a position where we could tie this all together and say why this is like a great conclusion, both for classical theism and for human free will. Let's just pull it all together in the following way, right? Like the conclusion we ultimately see, I think, right, is that even in the creaturely case, even in the human case, right, there is control exercised in a way where, given the same antecedent conditions, different possibilities going forward are possible. Now, of course, in the human case, these antecedent conditions flourish into intrinsic differences in the agent, which then further are determining causes for things that happen outside of the agent. But I guess part of what the classical theist is saying, is insisting on, is that in the divine perfection, God has no need of that middle step, right? God has no need of this step where he goes from antecedent intrinsic conditions in himself to that's step one, right? Step two is some kind of contingent accident in himself, which that's step two. And then step three, that contingent accident in himself is a determining cause of something that happens outside of himself. And I guess I think we're both saying this. I think we are on the same page here. We're both saying in God, step two just never occurs, right? You just go straight from intrinsic antecedent conditions to what is caused externally, without any middle step intrinsic accident in the mind of God, which determines what occurs outside of him. And this vindicates both divine simplicity and in virtue of showing how not only is this not a problem for the doctrine of divine simplicity, but we can even show how this points out how God is, in a very concrete way, acting in a way that is analogous to the way that creatures act. He's just cutting out a middle step that involves imperfection, this requirement to introduce difference in oneself before one can introduce difference in the world.
Yeah.
While also, as your book aptly and ably points out, this perfection in God then leaves room for, because it involves no determining accident in the mind of God with regard to human free choices, leaves room for what we can call, in the contemporary terminology, libertarian human free will.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm 100% with that.
Awesome.
All right, John.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that was marvelous to listen to. And I was looking at the chat, and a lot of the conversations were either debates on like Calvinism and Scripture and Augustine, or just other issues, at hand. And there's one friend of mine, Dawson, and he said, "Hey, Swan, my brain is in pain." And I think it might be good for the audience if, like, maybe insofar as it's possible, just to break down what is this conclusion that Professor Grant and Professor Tomaszewski have come to. Grant, do you think you could maybe walk us through it very briefly, just like what's the final outcome here?
Yeah, I'm sure whatever I just said can be better said.
Yeah. So I thought you did a great job, Christopher, and I'm going to try to see if I can state it just even more briefly, which will leave out maybe important details, but hopefully will maybe help somebody whose brain is really hurting. Whether or not God's causing our actions is consistent with their being free in sort of a robust libertarian sense is going to depend on how we understand God's agency. I think we're proposing that we understand God's agency in such a way that for him to bring about our act doesn't introduce any factor that determines them. And so it's consistent with libertarian freedom. And the reason God's bringing about our act doesn't introduce any factor that determines them is because what it is for God to bring about our act, what that consists in is just our act with its relation of causal dependence on God. There's no third thing that God has to introduce, some third determining factor that necessitates our act. He just immediately brings about our act without any determining factors at all.
Yeah, Christopher, do you find that satisfying?
Yeah. I guess I just try to add to that, that if people are worried about the way that sounds, if people have the kind of worries that I think Joe Schmidt has in his work about what that means for divine control over over what is created or over what human beings do, if we like some kind of so-called divine determinism, then the answer to that, at least if you like libertarianism at all, in the case of human agents, is, well, tough luck, because that's how it is all over, right? Every free agent is going to have some step in the process where, unless you're going to go full bore compatibilist, where you just say that everything is antecedently determined. Every agent, even in the created order, has some step where they go from antecedent conditions that are the same across two possible worlds to, I guess, in the human case, right, a choice or an intention, something internal to us that wasn't determined by those antecedent conditions. And all that Dr. Grant's book adds to that, right, in the divine case, is saying, what if we just cut out all the internal stuff with respect to God and say that we go straight from these antecedent conditions in God straight to different free human choices. And if you don't like that, if you think that is somehow problematic, then at the very least, objectors owe us a convincing account of how human free choice is supposed to work, that doesn't amount to a full-blown determinism, because, well, at least for anybody who is a Christian, that arguably does face problems. Big problems. Yeah.
Also, Christopher, I'm just curious, would you still say that you hold to a theological determinism, or would you kind of modify that now? Or
Yeah, so right. Okay, so now you
not to put you in the hot seat, hot spot, yeah.
Yeah, when I get back to thinking about like how I think about just not doing philosophy anymore, right? Just thinking about like dogmatic Christianity, right? Doing like dogmatic theology. It seems to me like I do have a hard time getting away from this idea that there's something going on in the mind of God, from eternity as to like who the elect are going to be, right? And so what I'm about to say just arguably goes in the face of everything I just agreed to. But this is another thing I've flirted with, which is to say, okay, well, what the doctrine of divine simplicity commits us to saying is that across all possible worlds, in the order of what Aquinas would call esse naturale, right? A natural being or physical being, God is the same across all possible worlds. But that this does not require us to say that God is the same across all possible worlds in terms of esse intentionality, right? An intentional order, right? And so I've flirted with the idea of saying, no, there is something like this, what I was earlier calling this second step, where there's something contingent in God, so to speak, right? But not in the natural order, not in the order of esse naturale, not in order of natural being, because that's what the doctrine of divine simplicity excludes. But right, maybe we can say, right, there actually is in another possible world a divine decree, right? Maybe, right, a divine decree where the list of the elect looks different in the mind of God, and this is something in some sense intrinsic to God, right? This isn't just as we were discussing at length before, something that we attribute to God by extrinsic denomination. This is really something that God has resolved within his mind intrinsically to bring about, and it is determining in just a way that Professor Grant wants to completely exclude. Because, right, yeah, just to be clear, like the reason I have flirted with that is because I'm just concerned about solving the divine simplicity issue, right? And if I can say we can have divine simplicity and also say that God is in control of what he creates and who he saves and so forth and so on, whatever it is we want to say God is in control of, without compromising divine simplicity, then at the end of the day, I'm satisfied, because I don't start off with the strong libertarian intuitions that Dr. Grant starts off with, right? And so if I have to shed those as we go, then I'm happy to do it. And the dogmatic theologian in me, which is a small part of me, because I am not a theologian and not a dogmatic theologian, is actually very attracted to this picture. At the same time, of course, everything we've discussed up to this point has this marvelous theoretical beauty to it, insofar as it reconciles everything we want to say about divine simplicity with everything we want to say about human free choice, with everything we want to say about God being, in the requisite sense, in control of what he's creating, and in the way that he is being provident over that creation. But I guess this is just stemming from the fact that because I'm not starting from the position of trying to solve the same problems. Here, I'm happy to give certain things up that I think Matthews is not. So, as far as I'm kind of still undecided. I'm just like, I could go either of these ways. I could go the way that we've just hashed out, or I could say that the doctrine of divine simplicity is somehow compatible with intrinsic difference in God across possible worlds in the order of esse intentionality. Yeah.
So good. So a lot of that stuff that you want to retain, you know, I guess from the dogmatic theology side, is stuff I want to retain as well. And I think you can retain, although with some, you know, maybe slight modifications to the way you were characterizing it. So
Right.
I think you can have, different divine decrees, election choices across worlds, right? Like you wanted to say, but those decrees, elections, choices, whatever, are going to be on my accounting. They're going to be extrinsic rather than intrinsic. Okay, they're going to be exercises of control because they're intrinsically exercises of control. They're not exercises of control that depend on some prior determining factor within the agent that brings about the decree or the choice. They are just to bring about certain effects for a reason, is to bring about them purposefully, to bring them about intentionally. It just is an exercise of control. So you get control, you get variation in God's choices and decrees and elections and so forth across worlds, but it's extrinsic rather than intrinsic. If you, I don't know, I don't want to speak too long. There are a couple of other points I might make, but I don't know if you've got other questions that you needed to get to, Suan, or should I go on?
Let me just say one thing really quick, and there is one audience question I want to get to, but just let me thank the catechumen for giving super chat. Everyone like and subscribe or anathema. That was certified by Pope Leo XIV. Trust. No, I'm kidding. I just want to give that shout out. And Professor Grant, go ahead with your questions. And then I just have one audience question I think that I'll get to before the end of our time.
Okay. So the two other points. So some on this question of control. Okay. So Christopher, you were raising this concern that some have, and maybe you share to some extent. I'm not about how God could be in control of what he causes, or how he could be in control of his choices of intentions and so on. All right. So the move that people who make that objection, what they end up wanting to say is, in order for God to be in control, there's got to be something intrinsic and contingent within God, in virtue of which he exercises that control. Okay. So that just raises the question, well, how does he exercise control over that third thing, that little contingent accident that's now been introduced into God?
Yeah.
Say God's choice, right? So how, if he needs to have an intrinsic choice in order to have control over the world he creates, how does he have control over that intrinsic choice, given that he could have made choices for many, 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 many other worlds? So the solution it just relocates the problem, right?
100% agree, and I've said the same things about this objection in my work. I 100% agree. I'm not disagreeing at all. Let me ask you this though, because I'm just kind of curious. So, like, on an extrinsic denomination model of intention, like, what makes it true on your view? What makes it true that before the foundation of the world, God had chosen Peter? What makes that true on your view?
Yeah. So let me say something. This would be a longer conversation perhaps, but I I don't think of it as a matter of denomination so much. I mean, maybe we could talk that way, but just as to what God's causal act consists in, or what God's willing effect consists in, right? What it consists in is stuff that's extrinsic to God rather than intrinsic.
Right. So then let me rephrase then.
But that
what in virtue of what extrinsic facts was it true that God chose before the foundation of the world to save Peter and not to save Judas? Yeah.
Well, so I'm taking it God here is eternal, right? And so that all of creation, all that he brings about is present to his, to his eternity.
Right.
So far, so good.
Yeah.
So I think it's the case from all eternity, from his eternal vantage point, which is in this sense prior to the creation of the world. From his eternal vantage point, he is bringing about and willing whatever it was about Peter that you were saying,
that he intends to save Peter. Yeah. So
willing Peter's salvation. Okay. But the willing of Peter's salvation, what that act consists in is, something extrinsic to God. But it can be said that it's prior to, the world, or from all eternity, because it's something that is present to God's eternal vantage point.
Well, okay, I'm not sure I get it. So are you or are you not saying that it's is it true from eternity that God wills to save Peter? Is that true from eternity?
I think so. I mean,
even though
it depends what that phrase, comes to.
Well, so on your view, of course, right? Part of what the fact of God's intending to save Peter consists in is this irreducibly temporal fact of Peter doing the meritorious things that he does to be saved in time. And so I'm not sure I'm clear on how it is eternally true that God intended to save Peter without positing, and this is part of where I'm coming from, right? Like why I'm concerned about this, without positing some kind of contingent fact about God in the order of intention, not in the physical order, not in the natural order, but in the order of intention concerning what his plan is for Peter. Yeah.
So, I mean, if you ask the question, was there ever a time at which God wasn't willing Peter's salvation? I assume you want to answer that question, no.
Yeah, that's right. I want to say that, like, when since we have Suan here with us, I want to say that back when Eliakim is running around Israel, that at that time God is willing the salvation of Saint Peter. That's right.
Okay. So there's never a time at which God was not willing Peter's salvation. I take it that's because what God is willing is always present to his eternity, right? But God's act of willing, so all of God's acts are always present to eternity, but that doesn't mean that what they consist in is intrinsic to God or identical to God.
Is it?
I discussed this a little bit. There's a place in the book where I'm talking about divine and human dialogue and prayer, where I talk a little bit about this. How could the acts, a divine acts, be extrinsic to God, but also in a sense eternal? And I think you can make sense of that, but for some more details. But
is it? I mean, is it or is it not true in your view that the only thing present to God in his eternity is how God intrinsically is? Because that's the only eternal stuff is God and how he intrinsically is, right? Or is that not right?
The only intrinsic stuff is to God is God. Now God
Right.
has, I think there are contents of divine knowing that are distinguishable, but they're not, the divine ideas, in other words, right?
Right.
I mean, we can say that there are a multiplicity of divine ideas, even in a simple God. But but all of what happens in time is present to God's eternity. And some of what happens in time are God's actions, like his parting the Red Sea, for instance. That is something that happens, on my view, you can temporally locate. It has a temporal location, God's parting the Red Sea. But that act, which has a divine act that has a temporal location, is present to God's eternity. And because it's present to God's eternity, you can also say from all eternity, God parted the Red Sea. But there's a particular date and time in which the Red Sea is parted by God. So I think those things can be held together, but as long as you are careful to parse what you mean by the different phrases.
Okay.
Hey,
so Suan, I know
think...
you're dying to move along. Can I just push? I just want to push one more button on this.
Yeah, please.
So, Christ, of course, tells his apostles, "I chose you. You did not choose me."
Yes.
Does your account mean that God choosing me and me choosing him amount to the same thing?
I mean, it depends on what you take God's choosing us to consist in.
Right. And I'm worried that maybe God's choosing us consists in, on your account, me choosing him.
Well,
how do we distinguish those?
Well, it's got to be true. Well, do we choose him? I mean, I think.
And in the relevant respect, with the aid of his grace, I'm worried though that a purely extrinsic account has the and by the way, I'm saying all kinds of things that are probably going to get me in trouble later on in the literature here with things I'm going to want to deny later on. But I'm revealing all my weaknesses here. But I'm worried that I'm worried like on your view on this extrinsic model of divine intention, divine willing, divine acting, whatever we want to call it, for God to have chosen me, right, in the relevant sense of electing me and or preordaining me to eternal life and so forth, that all that consists in is my supernaturally meritorious actions together with their dependence on God. And is that right?
That's at least one sense of it. So like what is predestination, right? It's God granting us salvation. Now, predestination also depends on our accepting the offer of salvation, which is presumably a free choice. So how is that free choice that we make, that where we accept God's offer of salvation, how is that also something that God is a gift from God? Well, it's because God brings about our accepting the offer of salvation. And so you could say that that's what election consists in. Now, that doesn't mean that God's his gifting us salvation. That doesn't mean that it just is exactly the same thing as our accepting the offer. It's rather our accepting the offer of salvation as brought about by God, qua dependent on God. God's act of bringing it about that we accept his offer of salvation, and then his rewarding us salvation accordingly.
Okay, good. Swan, I won't keep us any longer. Yeah.
No, you're good. You're good. No, I was going to say that in the course of this little conversation, we've knocked out actually the audience questions that I was interested in. So, I mean, Christopher, if you want to, no, I'm kidding. I think we should probably call it here. This was a great conversation, and gentlemen, I had such a great time listening. Yeah, Professor Grant, I realized that I didn't ask or have you introduce like where you're teaching from. You know, obviously Christopher's at Belmont Abbey. Just talk a little bit about yourself and your work. And maybe from there we can close out the episode just to have you direct the audience to where we can find more of your research.
Yeah, so I teach at University of St. Thomas. There are at least two universities by that name. One of them is in Houston, Texas. They have a very fine philosophy department, a lot of good Thomas down there. And one is in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I teach in the northern one. Where they get more snow, even though I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia. So, yeah. So, and I have it's been a great place to teach. Have great colleagues in the department, and it's a lot of fun. So, I've lived here for 20 years now, I guess. Never thought I would live in Minnesota, but yeah. And so I mean. Most of my work has and continue to work on these questions of the relationship between divine and creaturely agency and divine simplicity, and we explored earlier how those are connect, and other related topics. Occasionally stuff on evil, the problem of evil, and yeah. So it's kept me off the streets, kept me busy.
That's right. All right. Well, gentlemen, once again, thank you so much for coming onto my channel today. And if you want to read, Professor Grant's kind of, full extrinsic model, there's the Free Will and God's Universal Causality book. And was it Christopher has also contributed to this conversation on modal collapse and divine simplicity in the Jonathan Fuqua volume, Classical Theism, New Essays in Defense of Divine Simplicity. So
I highly recommend reading that. That's all excellent. Yeah, excellent work. So,
all right. Well, gentlemen, that's all I have planned for today, but I just want to thank you again for coming onto my channel.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Swan.